The first time I heard the words, "You're being fined $800 for unauthorized scenery," I nearly dropped the phone. Unauthorized scenery? It sounded like some kind of bad joke. But the HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman named Marlene, who everyone whispered about behind closed doors, wasn't joking. Her voice was cold, official, and dripping with that fake authority that makes your blood boil. Let me back up. This wasn't just any patch of land. This was the lake. My lake now, though for decades it had been forgotten. Covered in weeds, its waterline receding like the pride of the small town I grew up in. When I was a kid, my father used to take me fishing there every Sunday morning. He'd pack 2 sandwiches, mine always with too much peanut butter. And we'd sit by the water watching the sun climb out of the trees. He told me the lake was alive, a place that remembered families, laughter, and promises. But when my dad passed, the lake fell into neglect. Developers came. The HOA took over the surrounding homes. And slowly the water grew murky, the dock collapsed. And the people forgot. But I didn't forget. That's why, 40 years later, when the deed to that crumbling lake came up for sale in a dusty courthouse auction, I raised my hand and bought it. Not for profit. Not for power. But because it was home. Because every stone along that shoreline still carried my father's voice. I didn't know at the time that buying back my childhood would spark a war with the HOA. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after I started restoring it. I hired a few local workers, old friends, who remembered the lake like I did, and we started clearing brush, rebuilding the dock, and cutting down the rotting wooden fences. The air smelled like fresh sawdust and earth again, and for the first time in years, kids from the neighborhood wandered over, wide-eyed, watching the water return to life that evening. As the porch lights flickered on across the subdivision, a shadow fell across the dock. It was Marlene, HOA president, clipboard in hand, and that same purse-lip glare she always wore like armor. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" I looked her square in the eye. "Restoring my property." Her eyebrows shot up, sharp as daggers. "Your property? No. This lake belongs to the community, and you can't just rearrange scenery without approval." Scenery. She said it like the lake was some fake backdrop at a theme park, instead of living water that had raised generations. I pulled the deed out of my back pocket, the ink still fresh. "Actually, it's mine. Bought it fair and square at auction. All legal." For a moment, she didn't have words. She just stood there, porch lights flickering behind her, neighbors whispering from their windows. Then she hissed, "We'll see about that," and walked away. I thought that was the end of it. But I was wrong. The next morning, a bright yellow paper was slapped onto the half-rebuilt dock. HOA citation. Unauthorized modification of community property. Fine, $800. Deadline, 30 days. I laughed at first. It was so absurd. Unauthorized scenery? What did that even mean? But then the anger hit me. Hard. This was my father's lake. My family's memories. And now some self-important HOA president thought she could bully me into letting it rot just to preserve her control. I tore the citation down and stuffed it in my pocket. But Marlene wasn't finished. Within days, the neighborhood was buzzing. Rumors spread faster than fire that I was destroying the ecosystem that I was bringing in. Outsiders that I was making. The place unsafe. One man even accused me of attracting undesirable activity just because a group of kids waved little American flags by the water as we rebuilt the dock. It wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was personal that night. As I sat by the lake, watching the moon ripple across the water, I felt the weight of it all. Nostalgia, anger, pride. My father's ghost in every reflection. I swore then no matter what fines they threw at me, no matter how many neighbors turned their backs, I wouldn't stop. The lake was coming back, and if the HOA wanted a fight, they were about to get one. If I thought an $800 fine was the worst they could throw at me, I hadn't seen anything yet. 3 days after I tore down that ridiculous unauthorized scenery citation, I noticed something strange. Cars lined up outside the clubhouse on the far side of the subdivision. Porch lights glowed like watchtowers. Neighbors slipped in and out with hushed voices, carrying papers and CLIPBOARDS. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. The HOA was holding a secret meeting, and the topic was me. I'd grown up in this town long enough to know how whispers spread. That night, while I sat by the lake in silence, the words floated across the water like poison. He's trying to take over. He'll ruin property values. The lake belongs to us, not him. What stung most wasn't Marlene's scheming. It was hearing old family friends, people who once fished the lake with my father, parroting her words like sheep. Nostalgia is powerful, but fear? Fear can erase memories faster than time. The next morning, a manila envelope appeared in my mailbox. No stamp, no address. Just my name written in block letters. Inside was a formal notice of motion. The HOA was petitioning to reclassify the lake as community property under their jurisdiction, despite the deed that said. Otherwise, my hands shook as I read it. They weren't just fining me anymore. They were trying to take everything. I sat on the porch staring at that envelope for a long time. My father's voice echoed in my head. Never let anyone take your ground, son. Not when it carries your family's name. So I dug deeper. I spent hours at the county courthouse, shuffling through dusty records, breathing in the stale scent of paper older than me. And that's when I found it buried in a stack of handwritten documents from the 1940s. The original deed. It wasn't just a property description. It was a contract. The land surrounding the lake had been developed later, but the lake itself? It had been privately owned since the day it was carved out by hand, long before the HOA even existed. The language was ironclad, perpetual private property. To be maintained by title holder, not subject to community governance. I almost laughed out loud in that courthouse basement. Marlene had overplayed her hand. But I didn't just walk away with the deed that day. I walked away with something more powerful, a story. Because scrawled in the margins of those old papers were notes. Names of families who had donated time, money, and labor to keep the lake alive. My father's name was there. His best friend's name. Even the grandfather of one of Marlene's most loyal board members. This wasn't just about ownership. This was about legacy. When I showed up at the next HOA meeting, they weren't expecting me. The clubhouse was packed wall to wall, neighbors buzzing like bees. Marlene stood at the front, sharp blazer, sharp smile. Ready to announce her motion? That's when I walked in, holding the original deed. High in the air, the room went silent. You want to talk about ownership? I said, my voice trembling but strong. Here's the truth. This lake has never belonged to your board. It was never part of your jurisdiction. And this, I held up the yellowed document, proves it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Marlene's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. Forgery, she spat. That's what that is. You think we'll just take your word for it? I laid the deed flat on the table for everyone to see. Every signature, every official seal, every brittle page spoke louder than I ever could. And then I did something Marlene didn't expect. I read the names. Out loud, John Miller, Samuel Hayes, Thomas Reed. These are the men who built this lake. They gave their sweat, their time, and their pride. They believed it belonged to families, not boards. And you know what? Some of you here are their children, their grandchildren. I saw faces soften. I saw people glance at each other, recognizing names they'd only heard at family dinners. For a moment, nostalgia cracked through Marlene's grip, but she wasn't giving up. This is irrelevant, she snapped. Even if that document is real, you're altering the landscape without approval. You're disrupting the community. And then she pointed to me, finger trembling with fury. Neighbors, this man is dividing us. He thinks he's better than you. He thinks he can claim your heritage as his own. The room stirred. Some nodded at her words. Others looked away, ashamed. That's when I made my choice. I wasn't going to win this with paperwork alone. I had to win it with heart. So I invited them all. Tomorrow evening, I said, come to the lake. Bring your kids. Bring your memories and see for yourselves what's really happening. A circus show, pathetic. But the neighbors, they listened. The next night, as the sun dipped low, lanterns glowed around the lake. Families gathered hesitantly at first, whispering, unsure. Then kids started running across the half-finished dock, their laughter breaking the tension. Old men leaned on canes, staring at the water with misty eyes. Mothers took pictures as the moonlight shimmered across the rippling surface, and I stood there remembering my father. Remembering those peanut butter sandwiches, remembering what it felt like to belong to something bigger than myself. For a few precious hours, the lake wasn't a battleground. It was alive again. But Marlene was there too, standing at the edge, arms crossed, eyes cold. When the last lantern flickered out, she stepped forward. "This changes nothing," she hissed. "You're still in violation, and the fines will keep coming." Then she leaned closer, her voice like a knife in my ear. "Mark my words. You'll regret ever buying this place." The next month was war. The HOA kept firing off citations like bullets. Unauthorized scenery, unauthorized gatherings, unsafe dock structure, noise violations, $800 here, $1,000 there. The total fine stacked so high, they could have bought the lake twice over. Every day, I'd find another envelope on my porch, stamped in red ink, notice of violation. Neighbors avoided my eyes. Some whispered apologies, others muttered that I should just give up and move on. And every night, I sat by the water, staring at my father's reflection in the moonlight, wondering if I was crazy to fight so hard, but giving up. That wasn't in my blood. So when the official summons arrived, private property owner, I took a deep breath and prepared for the battle I knew was coming. They wanted me in court. They wanted to humiliate me, crush me under legal fees, and scare me into surrender. Fine, let's dance. The courthouse smelled like old wood and dust. The kind of place where small-town justice feels bigger than it is. On one side sat Marlene, sharp as ever, flanked by 2 attorneys the HOA had hired with community funds. Their suits were shiny, their smiles smug. On the other side sat me, alone with a stack of papers, the original deed, and a folder stuffed with handwritten notes I'd collected from families who remembered what the lake once was. The judge. An older man with tired eyes looked over the case file. The Homeowners Association alleges that the defendant, despite holding the deed, has violated community bylaws and owes fines exceeding $12,000. Defendant, how do you plead? My voice cracked, but I forced it steady. Not guilty, and not one dime owed. Marlene's attorney smirked. Your Honor, regardless of the deed, the defendant has disrupted the neighborhood with unauthorized construction and events. He is destabilizing the community. Then Marlene leaned forward, her voice dripping with poison. He's turning our neighborhood into a spectacle. We never approved his changes. We never asked for his lake. Her lake. That's what she wanted. Control. When it was my turn, I unfolded the original deed and placed it gently on the judge's bench. Your Honor, this document predates the HOA by decades. It clearly states that the lake is private property, not subject to community governance. That alone makes every citation unlawful. The judge studied it, nodded slowly. But I could see doubt lingering. Lawyers are good at twisting words. Marlene's team was slick. That's when I pulled out the names. These are the families who built this lake. Their blood and sweat are in its soil. Some of their children and grandchildren live here today. They remember. They know the truth. Marlene's attorney scoffed. Sentiment doesn't hold up in court. But just then, the doors creaked open, and in walked an old man with a cane, moving slow but proud. His presence shifted the entire room. Whispers rose. People recognized him. It was Mr. Hayes, son of Samuel Hayes, one of the original men who carved the lake. He was in his late 80s, a living relic of the town's history, and in his hand he carried a leather-bound journal. Your Honor, he said, voice gravelly but clear, this is my father's journal. In it, he wrote about the work he and others did to build that lake. He wrote that it was to remain private, protected, and passed down to those who loved it. He signed it. And he mentioned names, including the father of Mrs. Marlene herself. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Marlene's face drained of color. That's irrelevant. She stammered, but the judge leaned forward, eyes sharp now. Bring it here. Page after page, the journal told the story. Dates, measurements, agreements. The intent was clear. The lake was never ever meant to fall under an HOA's control. It was family ground. Heritage ground. By the time the judge closed the journal, the room was silent. He turned to Marlene. Your board has overstepped its authority. The deed stands. The journal corroborates. The citations are null. This court rules in favor of the defendant. I can't describe the relief that washed over me in that moment. It wasn't just about winning. It was about defending my father's memory, about standing up for something that mattered. But the judge wasn't done. As for the plaintiff, he continued, looking directly at Marlene, this court strongly advises a review of your governance practices. Abusing authority for personal gain is unacceptable. The gavel struck like thunder. Case dismissed. Outside the courthouse, neighbors surrounded me. Some clapped my shoulder. Others apologized for doubting me. Kids tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking if they could go fishing again. And Marlene? She stormed out red-faced, avoiding every eye, her power fractured beyond repair. Within weeks, she resigned from the HOA board, though everyone knew she had no choice. I went back to the lake that evening. Lanterns glowed again, this time without fear. Families gathered on the new dock, laughter bouncing across the water. Someone brought a guitar, kids roasted marshmallows, and old men swapped stories about the days when their fathers worked the shoreline. As I stood there, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. I realized then that this fight wasn't just about property or money. It was about dignity, about protecting the things that tie us to who we are. And as I watched the moon rise over the water, I whispered to my father, we did it. The lake's alive again. Sometimes in life, people with power will try to take what isn't theirs, not because they need it, but because control makes them feel important. But history remembers the truth. Family remembers. And dignity comes from standing firm, even when the odds are against you. If you've ever fought an HOA, a nosy neighbor, or someone who tried to take what was rightfully yours, you know how heavy it feels. But trust me, there's nothing more rewarding than defending what matters. Have you ever had an HOA or neighbor try to control your property or your memories? Share your story in the comments below, because these battles deserve to be told.